first of all, I'd like to thank Nicola for her, as usual, very provocative talk. Her wonderful book, A Very Great Profession, has been one that certainly stimulated my interest in a load of women writers that I might not otherwise have thought about, so I thank her very much. And we haven't got Claire Bother, we've still got Sarah, and so the floor's now open for anybody who wants to ask our writers or make a contribution. I think there's a microphone coming round, isn't there?
There's two. There's one at the back, Joan, and there's me here.
There's somebody here.
Well, I've enjoyed today enormously. I'm probably one of the oldest people here, and I was at Newnham 59 years ago, and feminism just was not invented. I never met it at all. We loved men. I still love men. They are my very great friends indeed. And after a long life, I still love men. So I'm not at all clear at the moment why everybody gets excited over female writers. Yes, I have written. I've written 12 very racy, unliterary novels, which fortunately my daughter gave to Newnham. I don't know why, because I'm deeply ashamed of all of them. But men love them and read them, and not once did I think, I'm a woman, I'm going to write about teacups, or Virginia Woolf, whom I absolutely loathe. I'm going to write racy, good novels, and is that wrong? And should I be ashamed and go home immediately? Secondly, on the question of women, I mean, what we have to do basically is to shed the husbands and the domestic chores and get jobs in our own right. And then, of course, we can do what we like and, if you like, lead a full life in a men's world. I would like to ask Sarah, because I am a historian, should we not thank Henry VIII because he dissolved the monasteries in England and the convents as well. So after 1536 we didn't have any monks or nuns. But what happened to all our unwanted ugly ladies then?
Well, that's a very short question.
We'll do it. Let's take some more, yeah, and then we'll do stuff. Yeah.
I want to say so much. I'm going to try not to. But those were wonderful talks, both of them. It was fantastic. But since you came at the end, I'll carry on with the various things you said. Again, you raised so many issues that I'd like to take up, but I just wanted to say one or two things. It was interesting that you started with the Saul Bellow and that period. And I went from Newnham, where no feminism seemed to touch me, to America, where there was a great deal. And by 1971, I'd started a journal of women writers called Mary Wollstonecraft Newsletter, which became Women in Literature. And it was all buzzing, it was all going. And yet then I came back to Britain in the 1980s, and it was really as though very little had happened. So I'm interested as to why, particularly the academic feminist criticism got going so much in the States and did so little here. Second point I wanted to make is that it has now got going, and a few years ago, I'm in the 17th and 18th centuries, we did a survey, and apart from Oxbridge, which was that little bit different, as we know, the other universities were all actually teaching more women writers than men, and in my particular period, Aphra Behn was, for example, taught far more than Dryden, and this has caused great misery in the press. Occasionally there's a picture of Dryden and a very cross article saying, you know, this is ridiculous, this is political correctness gone mad. And finally, I wanted to say, when we talk about the canon, which interestingly, my American students always used to spell with two N's, and they thought the canon is booming again. That I had to review a couple of weeks ago Sebastian Faulks's book on the novel, and my God, you know, there it is again. It's the most manly book that you ever could imagine, and it was very much the great male writers until we got to the modern period. So I thought, here we go again, and that is the one that is now being put on television and that is being presented to the nation, and his canon is very much the old one.
Yes,
so,
I know.
Thank you.
We want one more, and then you take some.
intervene to say I disagreed when you cited Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie, because I think what might be mentioned is the female tradition of crime writing, which has always meant that we've had more cerebral crime than the stuff coming from America, which was until recently very much more bloodthirsty. And I quite see why you didn't see fit to mention your own sister, but Jessica Mann's books are excellent.
They are.
Wonderful.
My sister is a wonderful crime writer.
Yes.
But I think crime is a bit different from
Well,
what...
yes, but that's the trouble. I remember asking my mother, how do you decide what is the novel and what is just books? And I don't accept the distinction. And there's one more thing I must say while I've got this. I remember I was working for a publisher in the early 50s, and they, there was a science book, and Dr. E.V. Ryu said, this book, is it by a woman, Thornhill? And Peter Thornhill said, well, no, actually, I wrote it myself. And there was a horrible silence, and the managing director from next door said, but surely authors like cats are always a woman unless there's a sensible reason for supposing the opposite.
Thank you. There's one at the back, please.
Unlike your first commentator, I'm not going to say hooray for Henry VIII. I came here in the 1970s as a nun. I still am a nun. I am, of course, no oil painting, but I can assure you that that's not why I entered religious life in the first place. And the various friends that I have who are also of the male persuasion would have to tell you whether I was unwanted or not. I do think, though, that I came here in the 1970s because the headmistress of my school, who was also a nun, and who'd been here in the 1920s, said that Newnham was the only proper place for a woman to get a decent education, because it was the only proper place where women's brains were taken seriously. She was in the tradition of Mary Ward, about whom I write, who was the first nun in Catholic history to try and break through the idea that women should either be enclosed in the home or in the cloister. And in 1617 she wrote, there is no such difference between men and women that women may not do great things. Whether that is a feminist statement or not, it's certainly a claim for women's voices that comes to us from a long time ago in the teeth of the opposition of Henry VIII and everybody else like him.
Would you like to respond now? Because I think we've got a few questions.
Well, no, Sarah must respond because, of course, it's so wonderful to hear someone who's a nun who is not in prison. Sarah was using a nunnery as a synonym for prison. And I was too with Alex, so it's a different point.
But Catherine's point is really interesting, because one of the ways in which women's writing got marginalised, and still is by perceiving it as genre rather than as literary fiction. I mean, I have lived as a commentator as opposed to a writer for about 30 years now within a tradition of English literature. And from my very, very first job, which was as a very young producer on a program called Kaleidoscope on Radio 4, where I should just add that one of the most generous and extraordinary women who came into my ken early on was Claire Tomlin, who came in with her book on Mary Wollstonecraft, which I thought was fantastic, and who treated me at 23 as if I was a person with a brain. And let me tell you, that was not true of a number of people who came in from the literary world. But one of the things that was clear for me very early on was that there was literature and there was what women read a lot of the time. And I began writing crime fiction. And it was very interesting to me that when, for instance, Hawksmoor was written by Peter Ackroyd, it was a literary thriller, and therefore it was wonderful, but an existential thriller, which was a thriller and not literary, was not. And equally watching Hilary Mantel win the Booker for Wolf Hall as a literary historical novel, as opposed to a historical novel, which almost by definition, women read more than men. I certainly grew into a passionate love of history through outrageously unsuitable books, which were historical novels as a child. I'm going to say two words now. Angelique by, yeah, see, all right? So the way you actually begin the imaginations of young people moving into culture is often through books that will never be perceived as proper for any canon. And yet how the hell do you get them in there except by giving them that wider forum?
Yeah. No, well, I entirely agree with that. And while we were having coffee, I was being rather subversive about Jonathan Franzen's Freedom. Has anybody read it? Unreadable. Completely unreadable. I had to leave it on an aeroplane because I couldn't bear the thought of carrying it where I was going. But the point I was making is that if it was written by a woman, it wouldn't have sold 1 million copies in America. It is a very, very interesting point, that book, because it's well, I didn't think Corrections was any better, actually. It's the kind of book that people think women write and like reading because it's about a couple called Harold and Patty in the suburb and what happens to them over 20 years. It's absolutely dire. And one of the most depressing things to make one feel a complete outsider is that at Christmas, 12 people chose it as one of their books of the year. And you sort of read The Observer or whatever, and you think, why? Well, have they been reading the same book? And you know, this is the same as the Dorothy Whipple point, isn't it?
I know a few of the answers to that, to why so many people chose it. They'd all been sent it. And many of them don't read at all, particularly in political circles. So they thought, God, what's on my desk? Oh, they said, hopefully.
That's a very good point.
Yeah. And what will I look like a literary
Yeah, all of that. This will make me look reasonable.
Anyway, we're saving all of you $9.99 because you don't have to buy it when it's in a paperback.